So you did now learn how you can provide static and dynamic data to components and how you can use resolvers to get your data fetching out of components. Now, of course, in this application, we don't just have our username that we could resolve outside of the user tasks component, but we also got those user routes where I got a tasks component where we're using user tasks. And that's why I now also added the resolve property here and why I'm now using a resolve user tasks function for fetching those tasks. Now attached you find the updated user routes.ts file and you find the updated tasks component TypeScript file where I cleaned up the component to only rely on inputs in the end, and where I added this resolver function, which also takes the query parameters into account to fetch the tasks for a selected user and to then sort them. Now, when you do all that though, if you were using the two files I attached, you'll note that the app does not work the way it should. If I navigate to a user and I try changing the query parameters by clicking this button, you see the tasks aren't updated. Their order doesn't change. And I'm showing this on purpose because the default behavior by Angular is that these resolver functions will be re-executed if a route parameter changes, but not if a query parameter changes. That is a behavior you can change though by adding another property to your route configuration. You can add the run guards and resolvers property and set that to a string value. You could set it to always, which does what its name implies. If you set this, the resolver functions will always be re-executed whenever anything happens to that route. Or we could set it to params or query params change here, which is the setting we want because this will ensure that this resolver function here will be re-executed by Angular whenever our route parameters change or the query parameters change. So with this setting added to this route, this resolver will be called as intended. And if you now save that, you can see that as you navigate between different users, different tasks are loaded, and now sorting also works again, and those query parameters are respected again. Simply because we now changed this setting, and that's therefore also something you should know about. Now, in Angular, you can not just resolve data for a component, but also the title for a route. Because of course, as you navigate between different routes, you might want to update this page title, which for example shows up here, but which also would show up in search engine results. You might want to update that as you navigate between routes, and Angular also helps you with that. For example, Angular allows you to define a static title property for every route you set up. So you can simply add a title property to your route configuration and then set that to any string of your choice. Like for example, no task selected here or whatever you want. If I do that, if I add this title property like this, and I go back to /nothing, you see this title is showing up here. But it's of course also quite common that you might have some dynamic title that depends on some data that was loaded. For example, here, when we're on the user tasks component, if we're on this route or one of its child routes, we might want to set a title that outputs the username that was selected. So setting a static title will no longer do. But thankfully, title also does not just accept a string, but also some resolver function or class. So you can call a function just as you're doing it here to set your title. So for example, here we could go to the user tasks component and add a second resolver function here, which we could name resolve title, which will also be of type resolve fn, and which will also yield a string. And then here in the end, I also want to have a function where I get my activated route and this router state, though these type annotations here actually aren't needed. If you have this annotation, that's all TypeScript needs to understand what shape this function should be. And then here we can of course simply call our other resolver, resolve username, and forward our activated route and router state, for example, because that will then give me my username, and then simply append some other string, like for example, quote s tasks, so that overall here in resolve title, we can return the result of resolving our username and then concatenate this string so that we overall return a title like max tasks or whatever username we have. Alternatively, we could also copy and paste this entire code down here, but that's simply the shorter way of doing it. Well, and with that, we got this resolve title function, which we're exporting, and we can therefore go back to our routes and now set the title here to resolve title. And that now also must be imported from our user tasks component. And we need a comma here. But with that, this title will now be set dynamically. And that's all you have to do. If you do that and you save everything, if you select a user, you see that title here was updated and represents that username. And if I switch to a different user, the title also updates. So that's working as intended. And that's therefore another very useful feature that might come in handy.